Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Beverley Minster. It's wonderful to see so many of you on a cold winter's night. At least it's still and it's dry, which is more than it has been some of the last few nights. A very warm welcome to the latest of these lectures given by Marcus Ramshaw, who many of you now will be familiar with, a man who has done a lot of teaching in Cambridge and research. And I think it's worth emphasizing that what we are getting, we're very privileged that we're actually getting not just a few books, as it were, jammed together, but genuine original research on these topics. And I've seen some of the kind of obscure places that Marcus has gone for his research. And so he's turning up genuinely new material and sharing it. And we're the first often to hear it. Obviously, an evening like this takes a bit of money to put on, and a suggested donation of £5 per person, which covers some expenses and also having people out and having heating on and all of that. Now, a rather different event is being started next week by Marcus. It's in a pub which already has great value to it. And you will find the details on the back of the handout that I gave you. And I'll put the other handouts at the back at the end, so that if you didn't get one as you came in, you can get one as you leave. And what it is a number of discussions about various of Chaucer's Canterbury tales. And if you ever read them, you will know that a pub is a very good place to actually discuss them. And there will be some sort of banquet at the end. So, but Marcus has asked me to point out that the capacity for that is really about 50 people. So if you do want to come to this, I do suggest that you contact, there are details about contacting the pub, and there's a poster at the back as well. Now, I do have a bone to pick with Marcus. I started my Christian life at the little church of St. Mary's Swine, just outside Hull. And it's almost unique, one of only 4 churches in England and Wales still worshipping within Cistercian walls. And it was my lovely church, and I had this lovely fond delusion, which I've had for 60-odd years, that there were the nuns, living their life of prayer and service and poverty and all of that. But Marcus's next talk is entitled "The Naughtiest Nuns in England, ? Beverley and Swine Priory." Apparently, the good ladies of Swine had a bit of a reputation. So that will be the next one. Again, there's a poster out. That will be the 19th of February. It's also a great pleasure to welcome, if you came last time, to welcome once again Dr. Daniela Diamond, who is a musician, as you can already hear, with a medieval instrument. And so I hope that you are going to be in good voice tonight, because you may be asked to join in at some point. But she will be playing music of the period. But I think now the main thing is to hand you over to Marcus for this talk about what is sometimes called the Peasants' Revolt. Like so many of these titles, it was only actually given to it by the Victorians, as I'm no doubt Marcus will explain. But it's a fascinating event in history, the history of England, a period when, for a few days at least, the government of England almost totally broke down. Marcus, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. And thank you, Daniela, for coming from Hull tonight to play for us and to teach us the song at the end. Don't worry, you'll be taught it through. And I'm delighted to see so many people. The last talk I gave was on November the 6th, 10 weeks ago, 2.5 months. So I wasn't sure if you'd all come back, but you've come back in greater numbers. I've counted at least 120, 130 people here. We'll even give the Civic Society a run for their money at this rate, Dick. But it's delighted to see you, and particularly since it gets dark at 5 o'clock. And given, if we'd had this talk last week with the weather, I would have probably almost cancelled it. But God has looked down on us with some favour and some sunshine in what is still technically the bleak midwinter of January. Now, there's quite a lot to cover in my talk, but there'll be a good chance for questions and answers at the end. I do encourage you to go into as much detail as you want and press me, because I've tried to edit my talk down. I always write too much, and then I go off-piste a bit and then realize, oh gosh, we've been here for 45 minutes already and I'm only halfway through. I've been very disciplined this time on the word count and checked. But the Peasants' Revolt, or what is more generally known as either the Great Rising or the English Rising of 1381, is an absurdly complex matter, which historians still do not fully understand, partly in some cases because of a lack of documents, but all too often because there are too many documents. And it's difficult to disentangle the motives which brought together a huge cross-section of people. And we have labored under a huge misapprehension of the medieval world by just placing it into those categories. 5% of the society of England are part of the church, the clergy, and that includes monks, nuns, and friars. 5% are the nobility, 10% are the mercantile classes, and the rest, the other 80%, we all lump together as peasants. This is just not true at all. I've been trying to estimate how many people in medieval England in the late 14th century could properly be termed peasants, and it's less than half the population. I would estimate probably about 40%. There is a growing, burgeoning middle class in the medieval world, and it's the middle classes that principally drive the peasants, in inverted comma, revolt, which is why we probably find it more useful to talk about it as the Rising. Now, my talk's going to fall into two halves. The first half is going to describe and I'm going to stick with the term Peasants' Revolt because we're so used to it, and I'll disentangle the middle class bits as we go along. The first half will look about the national events, what happens in London, what happens in the southeast of England, particularly in Kent and in Essex, and how it spreads out, to Richard II himself meeting the peasant leaders at Smithfield. And then the second half is going to look at Yorkshire, and especially Beverley. And Beverley's role in a peasants' revolt is truly remarkable. It is astonishing. So, and then, as I said, there'll be a good opportunity for questions and answers. So, the first half, I'll begin. When Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? That was the famous rallying cry of the sermons preached by a former radical York chantry priest called John Ball in the later 14th century. The reference is to Adam and Eve being banished from the Garden of Eden, from paradise. And it was a play on words. And as such, it can mean two possible things. One, Adam delved or dug the ground to plant crops, and Eve span or spun a spinning wheel to make clothes for them both to wear now they knew they were naked. And they were both forced to work, having been banished from paradise. Alternatively, it might mean that Eve span or spread wide her legs, and Adam delved in ways best left to the imagination than for a talk in a consecrated building such as this. Linguistically speaking, this latter interpretation is probably the more likely of the two. But sexual innuendo aside, the key bit is, of course, the second part of the quote. Who then was the gentleman? Now, John Ball went on in his sermon to explain From the beginning, all men by nature were created alike, and our bondage or our servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. For if God would have had any bondman from the beginning, he would have appointed who should be bond and who should be free. Therefore, I exhort you, my followers, to consider that now the time is come, appointed by God, in which ye may cast off the yoke of bondage, fight, and recover your liberty. Stirring stuff. Thomas Walsingham's Chronicle records how he was freed from prison by the peasants during their revolt and how he preached to them. Thomas writes, and this is the principal chronicler source, an eyewitness source of the peasants' revolt, uprising. Thomas writes, and continuing his sermon, John Ball, who again is a chantry priest, so he's not a peasant, he's an educated man, he tried to prove by the words of the proverb that he had taken from his text that from the beginning all men were created equal by nature, and that servitude had been introduced by the unjust and evil oppression of man against the will of God, who, if it pleased him to create serfs, then surely in the beginning of the world he would have appointed who would be a serf and who would be a lord. Let them consider, therefore, that he had now appointed the time wherein they might lay aside the yoke of long servitude, if they wished, and enjoy their liberty, so long desired. Wherefore they must be prudent, hastening to act after the manner of a good husbandman, tilling his field and uprooting the tares that are accustomed to destroy the grain, and then they must go on first with the killing of the great lords of the realm, then slaying the lawyers, slaying the justices, slaying the jurors, and finally rooting out everyone whom they know to be harmful to the community in the future. So at least they will obtain peace and security. If, when the great ones in society had been removed, they maintained among themselves equality of liberty and nobility, as well as of dignity and power. And when he had preached these and many other ravings, he was in such high favor with the common people that they cried out that John Ball should be the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chancellor of all England, of the kingdom, for he alone was worthy of this office, for the present Archbishop was a traitor to the realm and the commons, and he should be beheaded wherever he could be found. And as we know, and as I will tell you later on, he would be found and he would be beheaded. Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England, by the peasants, and his decapitated head does still stay in a cupboard in a church in the village of Sudbury, up sort of Norfolk way. It's quite remarkable stuff. This doesn't sound like the late 14th century, does it? I mean, even with that hyperbole, I should think any politician giving a party conference speech could be quite impressed by some of that language and its description in terms of building up. You know, you can imagine this would go down very well. But John Ball himself would be executed, and he would be hung, drawn, and quartered at St. Albans in the presence of King Richard II on July the 15th, 1381. And it would be his head that will be displayed on a pike on London Bridge. Now, I'm going to try to make the whole Peasants' Revolt thing as simple as I can, but it's going to get increasingly complicated as we get on. And actually, the most complicated bit is the second part, that gets really complicated. But first, let's look at the background and the causes of the Peasants' Revolt. By the way, can everybody hear me clearly? Even at the back? Right. Yeah? Now, there are 5 key reasons which caused the Peasants' Revolt. These are 1, the impact of the Black Death, and labour shortages caused by up to half the population of England being wiped out in the space of 3 years, between 1348 and 1350, of bubonic plague, known as the Great Mortality. And even if you survive that, every decade, in the late 1360s and in the 1370s, there would be second and third outbreaks of the bubonic plague, which would particularly target children, because those that had survived the first outbreak, a bit like we learned with COVID, would have probably acquired a natural immunity, which those born later would not have. So the population is going down and down. And it has gone down to the extent that there are not enough people, literally, to sow the crops, to farm the fields, to bring in the harvest. And that, of course, will result in famine and starvation. 2, the gradual manumission and the partial decline of serfdom. Serfdom, which had been in existence since Anglo-Saxon times, has been gradually declining anyway throughout the 12th and 13th century, but largely due to economic pressures. And now it is going to accelerate in its decline. It's never actually officially abolished. Technically still exists. I've never met a serf, but it's very possible some people in this room, without knowing it, technically if you did your family history, well, yeah, actually you're still a serf. You never were given the freedom of anywhere. 3, the cost of the 100 Years' War and its apparent failure, particularly during Richard II's reign, at expensive costs, because the French still raid English coasts, particularly the south of England, where I once lived. Hythe, near Folkestone in Kent, is burnt to the ground by French ships. French ships attack Portsmouth, Plymouth, regularly. You know, we might think that 1066 was the last time we were conquered, but we've been invaded about 50 times since, and the French were continually harassing English towns on the south coast throughout the 100 Years' War. Ironically, King Richard II is a man of peace, and during his reign, his 22-year reign, he tries to bring an end to the 100 Years' War. He signs peace treaties, and there are ceasefires. But he also spends all the money on himself, on art, on palaces, on his own jewelry. So the ordinary people see no benefit. But then 4th, the most common reason, and it is still, although it's downplayed now by historians as a causal factor, but still actually the trigger point, the spark that turns ordinary villagers into outright rebellion against the king, is the excessive and harsh imposition of the third poll tax. After 2 other taxes in 1377 and 1379, is then followed by a third one in 1381. Why is the poll tax of the Middle Ages so catastrophic? Well, it is a graduated tax, so it does take account of your income to a point. Is that the rich lords and nobles do pay more, anything up to £1, whereas the peasants only pay pennies or shillings. But everybody over the age of 13 has to pay this poll tax, and it takes no account of your, although it's graduated, it takes no account of your ability to pay. So even the homeless are being forced to pay it. Even the serfs who would struggle to pay it can't. Now, Margaret Thatcher will discover later on to her cost the introduction of a poll tax. If you introduce a tax, no matter how fair it might seem on paper, if you do not take account of the individual's ability to pay and their income, you can't get blood out of a stone. And most people in the Middle Ages don't pay their tax in coin. They pay it in 2 chickens, 20 eggs, the pig they're fattening, or in labour. And by the third poll tax, which we'll come back to, this actually is the straw that breaks the camel's back. And then the 5th reason is the growth of Lollardy, which is a sort of early Protestant movement in England, but also in 1378, the papacy undergoes what's called the Great Schism, which lasts for nearly 30 years until 1415. The papacy throughout the 14th century had left Rome and moved to Avignon in the south of France, which is still a wonderful tourist destination, and the papal palaces are still there for you to go around. And that period from 1305 to 1378 means that the Pope is controlled not by Italian princes, but by the French king. So much so that English chroniclers talk about this period as the Babylonian captivity of the church. The Pope is one of the most powerful people on the planet. In 1378, it does move back to Rome, the papacy, the election of a new pope. But the French king keeps on appointing popes in Avignon. So the Great Schism happens, and we have two popes. The Pope of Rome in Rome, and the Pope of Rome in Avignon. And Europe divides. Countries go after each different pope. So France supports Avignon, Scotland supports Avignon, because England is supporting Rome. So when it comes to negotiations, this becomes a huge problem. It gets even more complicated in the early 15th century, because there are several councils to try to patch up this quarrel by electing a compromise candidate, a third pope, but the other two refuse to go. So we get the pope, the anti-pope, and the anti-anti-pope. Now, for the medieval mind, this is a disaster. So we see religious, political, economic, and social crisis points all coming together at the same time. Now, the poll taxes, and they were called such by the government, were universally hated and increasingly unjust with each successive tax. So, as I said, they took little account of the ability to pay, and the protections offered to poorer members of society vanished. In 1377, every man and woman over the age of 13 had to pay the tax. So from 13 years old, you were expected to pay the tax. And each individual. So if you've got a whole family unit, and you've probably got about 3 or 4 children in the Middle Ages, whether they're made to 13 or not is a different question. This is getting really quite expensive. The only exemptions to the poll tax were to the clergy, which include monks, friars, and nuns. I mean, technically, monks, friars, and nuns wouldn't really have the money to pay. And to the entirely indigent, vagrants, or the wandering homeless. Plus, of course, and this will be a wonderful PhD to write, the outlaw. I don't really know how many outlaws there were in medieval England. I would love somebody to do some research and try to work out how many there were, roughly. Women paid the same as men, irrespective of income. Now, in 1377, the tax rate for most of the population was set at 1 groat, or 4 pence per person. It suddenly tripled in 1379 to 3 groats, or 1 shilling, or 12 pence per person. And by 1379, we now get substantial tax evasion. And the population simply could not afford this. Because also on top of this, they have to pay a tithe of 10% to the church. Which is a bit like national insurance, really. And occasional taxes, and of course custom duties whenever they bought or sold stuff at the local market and with trading overseas. The tax became increasingly unjust, unequal, and untenable. A wonderful byproduct, and you've got a handout, is because of the poll tax and the incredible detailed records we have, if I could refer you to the handout, which hopefully you will have. I've got some more copies here which I can distribute if you don't have access to one. If you turn over to the second page, the poll tax gives us a wonderful opportunity to work out with considerable accuracy the population of everywhere in medieval England. And you might be surprised. So there you've got 1377 poll tax returns for the East Riding of Yorkshire, the top 30 towns in the East Riding. The East Riding is the wealthiest part of Yorkshire, It is the breadbasket of Yorkshire, and it also includes Yorkshire's Golden Triangle, which is basically Beverley, Cottingham, Kingston upon Hull, and Hornsey, a bit more of a parallelogram than a triangle. They're the wealthiest places. And what historians have argued is an accurate estimate. You have a list there of all the taxpayers. If we multiply between 2 and 3, those figures, we will get a very good estimate population. And it will probably fall somewhere in the middle for a mean average of 2.5. Beverley is, by this, and this is why we know from 1377, that it's not simply the 10th biggest town in England, but also it is the biggest town in Britain north of Lincoln or Nottingham. The second biggest town in Yorkshire is bigger than Newcastle or Durham, it's bigger than anywhere in Scotland. With a population with 2,663 taxpayers, it has a population probably in about the 6,500 mark. And just down the road, the second biggest is Kingston upon Hull, which has only been founded in 1299, 1300. It's only going for 79 years, but it still has, as you can see there, 1,557 taxpayers, population of about 4,000. But then, neighbouring onto Beverley, you have Cottingham, third biggest, and actually the fifth biggest settlement, so the sixth biggest settlement in all of Yorkshire. 767 taxpayers, population probably estimated about 2,000. Hornsey, about 1,700. Headon, 1,200. These are all very near each other. So you can see, and it's just interesting to note, if you turn over that first page, you see how the list goes on, and you can see various places which are surprisingly low down the list, and some places which are surprisingly high in the list. And it does give you a very quick oversight into how the population distribution and geography of England has changed. Because we have some places here which barely exist as villages today. Setrington, Wotton. On the third page, you've got Bishop Wilton, had a population of 550 in the last census, and that actually is probably slightly less than it had in the Middle Ages. Water, just below it, you'll see there, population of anything up to 750. Now, by Pocklington, very pretty village with thatched cottages, with a population of barely 100. Garton on the Wolds near Driffield, Sledmere, which is, much, much smaller today than it was in the Middle Ages. There's a note there about how also I've calculated an extra thing, because as well as the multiplier, we would add 5 to 7% to take account of the clergy and the indigent. The reason we give the multiplier of 2 to 3 is we're trying to take account of the amount of people under the age of 13, the amount of children. That's the reason for the multiplier factor. It also gives you a quick idea that the population of England after the Black Death is only about 3.5 to 4 million. In 2011, it was 53 million in the national census, so roughly 15 times greater. And actually, you might have seen in the news recently, we're now hitting 67 million, predicted to hit 72 million by 2032 after the next census. But for local historians, that is just incredible useful information. And I've got the figures for all of Yorkshire, for the North Riding and West Yorkshire as well. The second biggest town, of course, after London, is, of course, the city of York, which is about twice to 2.5 times the size of Beverley. But, I know I'm already nearly halfway through, the outline of the Peasants' Revolt. I'll try to speed up a bit. I haven't lost anybody, have I? I want to get the Beverley bits are the juicy bits, but we've got to get through some of this background. So the centre of the Peasants' Revolt was in London, and the rural counties of Kent, Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk, but it did spread elsewhere. The tinder flame that sparked the revolt was on May the 30th, 1381, at Brentwood in Essex, when a government tax collector, one John Bempton, was set upon by the villagers of 3 different villages, Fobbing, Corringham, and Stanford-le-Hope, whilst he was trying to find out the names of tax evaders of the third poll tax. He was lucky to escape with his life. He was beaten up, but he fled back to London. He came again, a second time, trying to collect the taxes, and here we probably do have to allow for some monastic chroniclers' exaggeration, because when he came back the second time, we're told that he found 50,000 of the commoners gathered against him, who went abroad throwing buildings to the ground and setting them ablaze. The primary target, however, and perhaps as the peasant revolt unfolds, that 50,000 would not be exaggerated. I'm sure when he turned up himself, it was. But it would morph into that. And it's interesting how organized these peasants are, so-called peasants. Because the primary target is not just mindless, wanton rioting and destruction, as we saw in the streets of our own country last summer in the August, but it is to destroy areas in which documents, charters, tax records were kept, and to kill lawyers in particular, and government officials who got in their way. There is a method to the madness of these revolting peasants. And inspired by the sermons of John Ball, a large group of ordinary folks set South England ablaze. Merchants, peasants, serfs, and their local office holders. And from Kent, they marched towards London. They pillaged and ransacked the outskirts of London, and from initially, they gathered together at Maidstone. They then acquire at Maidstone probably the most famous leader after John Ball, Wat Tyler, a man of Kent, then leads them into the city of London. And they destroy John of Gaunt's palace, they burn it to the ground, they besiege the Tower of London. King Richard II was only a 13, 14-year-old boy at this time. He is a regent. Well, he's not king. There is a regency placed over him because of his young years, and it's largely John of Gaunt. So King Richard II is blameless. His father, Edward, the Black Prince of Wales, who was expected to succeed King Edward III, had died tragically the year before Edward III. So Richard, who was actually a nephew of it, becomes king. So King Richard II is under guardians. He initially takes a refuge in the Tower of London. Now more and more rebels start to pour into London from Essex and East Anglia. The Archbishop of Canterbury is beheaded. He's found in the Tower of London trying to take refuge. On Tuesday, June the 11th, the child King Richard, now aged only 14, opened negotiations with the assembled rebel masses at Smithfield. Now, just think about those dates. How quick this has happened. The rebellion only started on May the 30th, stroke June the 1st. By June the 11th, London is ablaze, and the king, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England has been executed, and this young boy is now trying to open on Smithfield Moor in London, desperately trying to ask them their intentions of what they mean to do next. And they replied, led by Wat Tyler and John Ball, that they had come to save the king and to destroy the traitors to him and the kingdom. Richard replied, asking for time to delay, whilst he considered the right response he might give. And he did do this on the Thursday, just 2 days later, June the 13th. He listened by barge from the River Thames to their demands, which were the execution and beheading of the current king's uncle, John of Gaunt, and 15 other traitors. The king listened but made no promises, in which, after that, the rebels ran riot throughout the entire city of London, attacking the jails and setting free all the prisoners. So at this point, they destroy the Savoy Palace of John of Gaunt, and they set fire to all the law courts and books, Lincoln's Inn, places like that, and killed numerous royal officials. The following morning, Friday, June the 14th, so only 2 weeks from that beginning of that unfortunate man trying to collect the name of a few tax evaders, this lot are organised, and they've moved with considerable speed from East Anglia, Kent, Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk, down into the capital. And if they're so-called peasants, I don't think they would have had much of a horse. They would have done it on foot. The following morning, Friday, June the 14th, King Richard II, now besieged in the Tower of London, had to meet the rebels a second time to avert total disaster. So accompanied by his mother and his half-brothers and several lords and the mayor of London, he met Wat Tyler again and the rebels at Mile End. And then the rebels greeted him courteously but made two main requests: that they, the peasants, should be able to deal with the traitors by beheading them themselves, and now for the first time that serfdom will be abolished. And a standard rent for land across the kingdom should be fixed at 4 pence per acre for everybody, including royal dukes, only if the king accepted. Now we're beginning to see a complete re-evaluation of all the land. This is the beginning of certainly socialism, if not communism. And we will come back to that. Both of these demands the king agreed to. He even ordered charters to these effects to be written up, and the rebels might have thought that they had succeeded. And in many respects, they had. But now the lack of sustained discipline undermined this, and a splinter group of rebels took the king's concessions to the extreme. Law and order was abandoned as they now went off on a witch hunt of the traitors. Nigel Saul, who's the leading historian of Richard II as a biography of his reign, writes how in the eyes of some of at least the rebels, Richard's concessions amounted to a signal to do whatever they liked. The rebel horde rushed up to the main gate and the garrison of the Tower of London. And this is, by the way, is the only time the Tower of London has ever been breached. Built by William the Conqueror in the 1080s, the White Tower, it has never fallen apart in history, even to this day, apart from to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The Tower of London is plundered and pillaged by the rebels. They take away from the royal wardrobes all the coats of mail, plate mail, helmets, standards, including the royal coat of arms and those of St. George. In the royal living quarters, they sat on the king and his brothers' beds. They poked at everything with their filthy sticks and joked familiarly with the soldiers. A number of the rebels kept on trying kissing the king's mother. A few others tracked down young Henry of Derby, grandson of King Edward III and a prince, and would have killed him, but for the intervention of the bishop. Now, at least 150 to 160 foreign merchants, mostly from Flanders in Belgium, were also killed as they were seen rightly or wrongly, mostly wrongly, by the rebels as profiting from the poor. The following day, Saturday, Richard, only a 14-year-old lad, I mean, this must be incredibly traumatizing as a teenage boy who never really was brought up or expected to be king. He goes on a pilgrimage to pray at the shrine of St. Edward the Confessor at Westminster Abbey and agrees to meet Wat Tyler and the rebels again. For the third time, and it's Richard II who's the only person who's providing any effective response or leadership, whilst the rest of the government and the royal family are just hiding, terrified. And this leads to the final and most dramatic encounter between the boy king and Wat Tyler, again at Smithfield on the edge of London, in a field near a priory, Smithfield Priory. King Richard ordered the mayor of London, Walworth, to summon Wat Tyler to meet him personally, one-to-one, in front of all the rebels and in front of the king's bodyguard and his household. Wat Tyler came on a little horse, dismounted, half bent to his knees, and then, against all custom, shook the king's hand, calling him his brother and embracing him. This is not protocol today. It certainly wasn't protocol then. And, you know, obviously the royal court and the king's bodyguard would have thought, if that guy's got a knife, he could easily plunge it into the young king's heart or take him hostage with a knife at the throat. But unfortunately, the rebels, all too often, as they will experience later on in the pilgrimage of grace under Henry VIII, are too trusting in the duplicity of kings. Though to be fair, Richard II is in a rather impossible position, and he's only a 14-year-old lad. The young king asked Wat Tyler why the rebels had not returned home. And now Tyler, and it becomes increasingly apparent that he is quite tipsy, if not drunk, immediately turned nasty and swore. And he demanded a charter from the king giving new greater concessions. As well as serfdom to be abolished, he demanded an end to all laws, all outlaws to be pardoned, and the law of England to be abolished, the church to be stripped of all its wealth and disemboweled, and for all the people that to be given, save the king, to be distributed equally. A Reformation, well, even Henry VIII didn't come up with this idea. King Richard II agrees to all these demands. A long pause and a standoff follows. And Wat Tyler now demands from the king a jug of water because he's thirsty. And the day is so hot, which he's given by Richard II, who often gets a jug of water for this upstart rebel. And Wat Tyler drinks it, and now he demands a flagon of ale, which he also gets, and he also drinks. And he then climbs back on his horse, thinking he's just done all this. At this point, an esquire of the king's bodyguard, who must be just trying to hold his temper for as long as possible, broke forward and came on his horse and denounced Wat Tyler, and this is the cover of my poster of this talk, denounced Wat Tyler as the most notorious thief in the kingdom, and a fight broke out between Tyler and the king's squire. The mayor of London tried to intervene, and a fight with daggers followed, and moments later, Wat Tyler was dead. There are various accounts of quite what happened next, but essentially without Wat Tyler, the peasants' revolt quickly collapsed. The peasants lost confidence. Londoners and the King's Guard acted with a vengeance and broke the rebellion and started to slaughter the rebels. And at least 1,500 rebels are killed as a result that day. King Richard II is spirited away by his family and immediately reversed all his promises and all his concessions. As so often, and to the medieval mind was quite obsessed with this, the wheel of fortune had changed. One moment you're up, next minute you're down. Wheel of fortune had changed against the rebels. Now, Nigel Saul, the leading biographer of Richard II, does talk about some of the economic factors. But I'm going to skip out that bit because I'm already forgot to move to Beverley. I want to move to Beverley. So now you at least have a background to what happens in the peasants' revolt in those 2 to 3 weeks. Let's just look initially at the wider impact in Yorkshire. Now, the leaders of the revolt were clearly not ordinary peasants. They were the higher office holders of the peasant classes, people like Wat Tyler. So he's a kind of sort of peasant, but he's from a wealthier family, and he would be in the reeve of the lord of the manor. So a bit like, trying to think of a comparison in today, it would be like a sort of the lord, the estate agent, the chief agent, the manager of the manor for the lord. So he'd have been educated and would be in some high standing and would have would been paid to an extent. These are the people who are going to go on and become the middle classes very much as we know it. And this is the beginning, really, of a class warfare. So the leaders of the world are the richer peasants, the reeves, the bailiffs, the ale tasters, the church wardens, the very small-time merchants and craftsmen, primarily Wat Tyler and John Ball. Not very many serfs are here. And actually, in East Riding, we already have proof that serfdom is very much disappearing because the royal key manor of Burstwick down in Holderness, which was a royal palace, is already making loads of grants, giving former serfs their freedom from bondage and this is widespread from the 1330s onwards for the past 40 years. So even in the wealthiest part of Yorkshire, serfdom is already being voluntarily got rid of by lords of the manor. But in urban places, things were quite different. For the riots which took place in York, Scarborough, and Beverley were fierce and prolonged, and those in Beverley were particularly and especially violent. In York, the conflicts became increasingly complex, and they very much involved the Archbishop of York and the church. Especially in York, St. Mary's Abbey has a huge dispute with the people of Bouvem, but eventually this is largely resolved. Scarborough is a completely different kettle of fish altogether. There are significant revolts taking place in Newcastle, but the surviving records there are so poor that it's difficult to know quite what really happens. But Beverley, just excuse me for a moment as I try to find a different page, is a different kettle of fish altogether. The most interesting thing here is that the revolt of Beverley not only starts before the revolt in Essex and in Kent, and before the revolt in London, which, as I told you, began on May the 30th, but also continues for long after the revolt in London and the southeast of England has been crushed. Indeed, by at least over a year, 14 months, in fact, longer, before even a fragile peace is restored in Beverley. And actually it takes a full 5 years until 1386 before the former local government of the town of Beverley is restored. And that it takes 11 years later, in 1392, there's still a clear sense of grievance, grudges, and sedition bubbling over in Beverley, which actually will result even as late as 1408 with another threateningly dangerous, but still somewhat minor uprising. The revolts at Beverley it's difficult to disentangle quite when it began, but it certainly breaks out into open rebellion at the May elections to the 12 keepers of Beverley, the 12 keepers who run the equivalent then in the Guildhall, in the building which still exists today, which runs Beverley. And basically, in this sort of complex series of family disputes and rivalry between families, we see the poorer people of the town, in particular the suitors, which is the shoemakers. See Suiter Street, somebody who makes shoes. Millers, drapers, carpenters, artisans, so not the posh rich merchants at Flemingate who are trading with the Hanseatic League, but the poorer people of society rebelling against the rich merchants. This is a lower middle class versus upper middle class fight. There are no peasants in Beverley, not really. It's liberty. Everybody's going to be a free man anyway. And there is also huge resentment against the powers of the Archbishop of York. As part of that rebellion, these 12 keepers, who have apparently since time immemorial governed Beverley, the entire position, still today actually Beverley Town Council has 12 members, including their mayor. The council is basically abolished as a result of the people who are rebelling in the lower middle classes who have assembled in Beverley. It's not clear who their leader actually is. But for 5 years, Beverley Town Council running it is effectively abolished completely, and it's replaced with an older man and 2 chamberlains. So just 3 people who are newly elected. And for the first time, these people are also paid. And that causes considerable ill feeling, because previously they'd not been paid. And of course, politicians and MPs wouldn't really be paid until the late 19th century, early 20th century, which made it a problem for any poor person ever becoming an MP or holding political office. So it's interesting in the 14th century, in the Peasants' Revolt, these 3 people who now take over Beverley, and will do so for at least the next 5, if not the next 10 years, are now being paid. There are 5 factors which need to be observed about Beverley. 1, the revolt in Beverley, which probably had its origins back in the 1360s or 1370s, happens at the very height, the apex of Beverley's wealth, prosperity, and importance. Beverley will start to decline from the 1420s, 1430s onwards, a very long, slow decline throughout the 15th century. But in Richard II's reign, Beverley and York are both at the height of their wealth throughout history. That can be no coincidence that now it is flexing its rights. It might be a coincidence, and it looks like the revolt in Beverley was always going to happen, even if the revolt in London and the southeast of England hadn't. And two, the revolt in Beverley does have all the hallmarks of a class struggle. We have the names of all the rebels who were pardoned later on, and their occupations. And we can see there clearly is a lower middle class and an upper middle class. More than once, royal documents refer in Beverley to the younger men of the town turning out and ousting their elders, both in local government and from their homes and from their businesses. 4, the revolt at Beverley is the most serious and most violent revolt in Yorkshire, and Beverley is ultimately fined the most by King Richard II after order is restored, largely through the intervention of William Percy in July of 1382. Beverley is fined a staggering £1,100. That is at least £11 million in today's money, just for its rebellion against the king. And it's each individual in Beverley, I've got a list here from the state papers, has to give a bond of 100 marks, which is £66 personally to the king, on top of this fine, that they forfeit. They'll get it back if they keep their word. They'll eventually get it back after a few years. £66 would be about £660,000 today. This is a huge amount of money. 5, as the Beverley rebels are already largely free, it follows clearly that their grievances have got nothing to do with serfdom or villein status as it would have been in the countryside. Also, the rebellion at Beverley coincides with a massive dispute between the Archbishop of York and the provost and canons of Beverley Minster, in which a very impolitic, a very undiplomatic, quite narcissistic individual, Alexander Neville of the Neville family, who is the Archbishop of York, is trying to unnecessarily assert his rights over this place, over Beverley Minster, over the provost and canons. And basically he wants to get some more money out of it, he wants to be in charge of the elections of the provost, he wants to insist that the Archbishop maintains his own chaplains in his stores, he wants to sequester some of the money and rights that Beverley Minster has, and he is really part of the Neville family. I'm giving a talk to the Civic Society in September. Is a feud that will grow between the two growing families of Northern England. The Percy family on one side and the Neville family is what will trigger off, in many respects, the War of the Roses in the 15th century. Well, Neville here, as Archbishop, who's been shoehorned into the job by the Neville family, is more interested in his status and asserting his rights over Beverley Minster to such a point, and this goes on for nearly a decade, and eventually he's deposed. The Archbishop has to go off and live in exile in France, because all the canons of Beverley Minster go on strike. The first clerical strike, really, in history. And not because of some action of the king. It's not because the Pope pronounced an interdict or something. No, it's a good old-fashioned, right, down your prayer books, down your missals. Come on, lads, we're going to go on strike and we're not going to give in until this Archbishop listens to our grievances. It's unprecedented. Now, one of the leading families in Beverley, and I'll leave some of this towards questions, is the Coppendale family, and particularly Adam Coppendale, who is part of the rich sort of merchants, the upper middle classes, who actually is trying to assert or reassert his authority against this rebellion. But it does take 5 years. The lower rebels, this becomes really, really convoluted. Rebels, once they've taken control of the town council for the elections, they steal from Beverley Guildhall the town's Great Seal, some charters worth up to £100, all the sort of armoury and weapons there. They take another £100 that was due to the Archbishop of York for the rent of the Westwood, as partly also a result, probably of the peasants' revolts, that you get the Westwood. Because as a result of this, the Archbishop of York signs over the Westwood, effectively in 1382 or something, to the people of Beverley, and as it remains so today. So that is one curious byproduct of the Peasants' Revolt here. I have already talked for an hour. I could easily go, and this is having edited massively my talk. So I'm going to start to draw to a close and lead some of this to open questions and answers, because we've still got a conclusion and we've got some singing, and you're not going to get out not singing. What did the Peasants' Revolt achieve? Now, although on the face of it, all too often the Peasants' Revolt is still reviewed by historians today as having been a failure that was brutally crushed. It did achieve some lasting legacies. And these were, at least one, I kind of think the Peasants' Revolt wasn't actually a failure, because it did achieve its first directive, the immediate abandonment of the poll tax. So the poll tax is got rid of. It is finished. There is no poll tax after 1381 throughout the medieval period. There are a couple of attempts in the 17th century by Charles I and Charles II to restore the poll tax, but neither of them really work. Nobody is daft enough to try this one again until Margaret Thatcher in 1989. It's the community charge, which is quickly branded the poll tax. And I don't know if you remember then, gosh, I was 17, 18 years old. I remember the Labour Party put an advert, Neil Kinnock was the leader at the time, in which they talked about the Peasant Revolt. And you had on the television screen this party political broadcast of houses being burnt down and the Archbishop of Canterbury's head being chopped off because of this hated poll tax. And then it was quickly christened the poll tax. And then within a year or two, it is got rid of, and John Major quickly disposes of it. So, the rebels do succeed in getting rid of this. Second, it has a huge impact on the young boy king, Richard II, and his attitude towards his country. And Richard II is one of our most unfortunate of kings in many respects. He's king for 22 years, from 1377 to 1399. And for the first 20 years, he is ostensibly, although he's vain, he's so vain, he's credited by way of inventing the pocket handkerchief. Because he wanted people to not dribble at dinner. And he's the first person to insist to be called Your Majesty. That wasn't used before. You didn't call the king Your Majesty, you just called him King or Royal Highness, exactly. Sire, yes, or sire. But the term Your Majesty comes from Richard II. But then in the last 2 years of his reign, from 1397 to 1399, what becomes dubbed the personal tyranny of Richard II, he starts to demand huge amounts of taxation from all his nobility. He disinherits people and confiscates their estates, and it's not to pay for any wars with France, it's just actually to buy works of art, to create jewelry, to buy new crowns, to build new palaces, and it will result in his ultimate downfall by Bolingbroke, who will become, in his rebellion, Henry IV. And of course, Henry IV lands in that rebellion just down the road in East Yorkshire at the lost town of Ravenspurn, Ravensruhe-Odd, off near the Spurn Point Peninsula. But the psychological impact this has on the young king is sometimes used by historians to explain why Richard undergoes such a dramatic, sudden change later on. Free is no doubt that by the end of the 14th century, within 20 years, serfdom is completely got rid of throughout England. For the Peasants' Revolt is seen and is credited by lots of historians, particularly 19th century historians onwards, and particularly Marxist historians, as being the beginnings of socialism and the beginnings of communism. It is quite possible, I know one historian argues, a bit unconvincingly, that the term socialism is actually coined as a result of Wat Tyler and John Ball's preaching. And of course, one legacy of the Peasants' Revolt, which we all know, is the phrase, "The peasants are revolting." Now, singing time. Oh, well, I think we'll do the singing first. Now, you will have a copy here. Because there's a bit I want to read before we quite get to the singing. Although the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 largely affected the southeast, its effects were widespread. And I've spoken about Beverley, Scarborough, and York. But it's also clear that the disaffection also arose in both Cottingham and Kingston upon Hull. And it's hard to believe that these grievances will not have spread to some of the surrounding countryside. So we're going to sing the Song of the Yorkshire Partisans, which in 1392 is recorded 11 years after the revolt, and it remembers its events. And it's important to put this in its historical context, because John Burwell, Jr. of Cottingham and others were accused of composing this rhyme in English and having it publicly proclaimed in Beverley on the afternoon of Sunday, July the 21st, 1392, and in Hull on the following Sunday. And the rhyme, loosely translated by myself into modern English, runs as it does on pages 1 and 2 of your handouts. Now, Dr. Daniela Fountain, who's a musicologist from Hull University, who did her PhD on 16th century music and the modern cinema, and who teaches the guitar and the medieval lute, has prepared. It's not often you find a musicologist. They're as rare as hen's teeth. So she's a wonderful discovery who came to some of my talks last year. She has, and I've heard already, made her own adaptation of the surviving medieval melody and put it to my words. And we've tried to keep as closely faithful to the original so it still scans. So I will hand over to you.
There's always a funny juxtaposition, really, when you're looking at music from the 14th century. Of course, here we've got to translate it into modern English. So I'm kind of singing modern English on a melody from the 14th century, adapted from a piece by Guillaume de Machaut, who was, one of those people where music has survived from the 14th century, and actually a very well-known composer of the time. So this is now, my little composition, really, of these two. And I'm going to ask you later to join me in this.
Well, we can sing one through once, and then we'll try to...
I will sing it through once, and then we can have a little go and see how far we get. Okay. In the country heart we were, that in our district people should be with all strength supported. Among the friars it is so, and other monks and many so revolting, whether they sleep or stand. And yet we'll all help for each other and maintain him as our brother, both in wrong and in right. And also we will stand and fight, maintain our neighbor with all our might. Many men may come and go among us, both to and fro. I say truly, but Elysian, we will not suffer neither hop on of John with whatever men may be. For unkind we were if we suffered less or more than any villain hurting. It were quite double again. Together be it full knowing to direct our going. And on that purpose we now stand. Whosoever does us wrong, in whatever place it is done, even if he might also fight, also have I by both hope and might. He goes against us all.
What do you think?
He goes against us all.
try to sing that together, or do you want to go straight to questions and answers?
Shall we do the first verse?
The first verse. Let's just try to do the
First verse. So, right. In the country heart we were, that in our district people should be, with all strength supported. Among the friars it is so, and other monks and many so revolting, whether they sleep or stand.
We'll come now to some questions, and while you're thinking about the questions, just a little story from, did a parallel lecture when I was in St Albans, because St Albans was a major centre of the revolt, and as Marcus pointed out, it was where a number of the leaders were tried and executed, including John Ball. But often there were local conditions, and in St Albans, it wasn't lower middle class versus upper middle class, it was upper middle class and lower middle class against the very powerful St Albans Abbey, who had a stranglehold on the entire life of the town. And on one occasion, the leaders were all from the upper class. On one occasion, I was asked to give my lecture to Rotarians. Now, I don't know whether there are any Rotarians in the Minster tonight, but at the dinner beforehand, I was talking to the chairman, and I said, look, I hope I'm not going to give offence, but actually most of the leaders were the sort of men who would have been Rotarians today. And there was a pause, and I thought, oh no, have I done something? And he said, I am not in the least surprised. So what I'm going to do with the questions is I'll try and take as many as we can fit in. I will come down to you, give you the microphone. It is important with these microphones you do sort of virtually kind of sort of treat it like a lollipop almost, so that we can hear the question, and then, more importantly, then Marcus can hear it so he can answer. So who'd like to ask the first question? I see the lady down here.
Thank you. You teased us a little bit with mention of Adam Coppendale and his family, and I'm wondering what happened to him afterwards, and also what happened to John Burwald.
I thought I'd be asked about the Coppendales. There are lots and lots of Adam Coppendales. In fact, the Coppendale family, who are probably one of the wealthiest and leading families in Beverley throughout the 14th and 15th century, are almost always called Adam. Adam, son of Adam. It's like one of those sort of jokes. If you're ever in doubt who is ruling Holland, it's always going to be William of Orange. There's about 20 of them. The Adam of Coppendale, he's got a brief biography. He's trading records. There is one Adam Coppendale, since the beginning, really wealthy one, was a collector of customs at Hull. He was murdered at some point before 1336. He was exporting 29 cargoes in ships from Great Yarmouth up to Middleburg. He loses at least £2,000 worth of cargo to pirates. He's accused himself of murder in 1319 of other merchants. He's murdered in 1336 by Thomas Manby and Robert Seaton, clerks of Beverley. Then there are a whole stack of other Coppendales going through the 1370s and 1380s. And on the database of the rebels, in 1381, who make that sort of bond of £66, 100 marks to the king, there are at least, the Coppendale name turns up 40 times. In fact, it appears to me more and more, it's not quite clear this Adam Coppendale is a bit like, it is the Beverley Mafia in reality. And they also, in that database, they hold public office. They're excused. He survives. Adam Coppendale, who actually does turn against the rebels and gets the pardon and becomes reinstated for was going to be reinstated as one of the 12 keepers of the town, but he actually petitions King Richard II in 1383 to be deliberately excused any more public office, ostensibly because of his old age, because he claims he's 68 years old. But clearly, he's obviously done quite well enough out of the Peasants' Revolt, and is probably a bit fed up actually of being one of the 12 keepers of the town, because it's getting quite hot and quite dangerous in his position, and will quite happily, give over to his son, who's also, of course, called Adam Coppendale. So I've got even a whole thing I can give you about the Coppendale family afterwards, and Barbara English has also helped with some wonderful notes. But do you remember I did mention that in 1408, 28 years later, there is this other sort of little rebellion that breaks out in Beverley, and who do you think is the leader of it? It's Adam of Coppendale. Does that answer your question?
John Burwald.
John
Do
Burwald.
we know what happened to him?
I am afraid I don't know. Is he the guy? There are so many names here.
Yeah, he's the one with the song. Yes, he's responsible for the song, isn't he?
Oh, John Burwell Jr. of
Sorry,
Cottingham.
Burwald. Yes.
No, I'm afraid we don't really know. We don't really know what happens to him, because he's from Cottingham. So no, I'm afraid...
No, definitely.
Maybe he will turn up when I get around to do the history of Cottingham.
Okay, next question. Hang on. Yeah, I'm coming around.
What part, if any, did the guilds of Beverley play in the rioting?
The guilds?
The guilds, yeah.
Hugely. Guilds seem to divide. Half of the guilds go and support the lower middle classes, particularly the suitors, the shoemakers. Go with the carpenters, the buttermakers, the butteries, against the goldsmiths and the silversmiths. So there is quite a class warfare. And in the market, in Saturday market, you would have different quarters. There would be the butter markets, there would be a fish market, there would be a shoemaker's market, there would be a general market. There's even God-cheap Lane, which runs off Saturday market, was where you got all your bargains. That was the main charity shop, good and cheap. So they'd be with the lower middle class fighting against the other. There are 40 guilds in them. Some are very, very rich. There also, which I didn't have a chance to take on, is that the upper middle classes of Beverley, and this does really particularly incense the shoemakers and the carpenters, the more humble people, is the merchants, like the Coppendales, who are making fantastic wealth with Hanseatically exporting to Sweden, to Denmark, to Holland, to Germany, to Belgium. Treat the poorer, lower middle classes quite arrogantly in Beverley and refuse to ever let them be part of the 12 keepers of the town. And there is that sense of huge resentment, particularly against, also some of them are foreign. That's why we get Fleming Day, so they're mostly sort of Flemish people there. My late supervisor, Mark Conrad, a firm believer in databases. He was professor of history and head of history at the University of York. Sadly died of bowel cancer in 2022, and he was the leading authority on the Third and the Peasants' Revolt. He was a firm believer in databases, and through one of the last research grants that he managed to get from our membership of the European Union was to construct a database of all of England's immigrants between 1300 and 1540. And you can find it free online. If you just type into a Google search, anybody can do it. You don't have to be a member or an academic to access this database. And he has compiled, with the help of, it was nearly $500 million or something research grant. They literally found every person who had immigrated into the 14th and 15th century in England's population. And in Beverley, you'll find a list of about 20 different people just in that database. And they're people from Iceland, from France, from Scotland, people from the Low Countries, and the Flemings of Flemingate. What I know Mark Cornwall really wanted to do, sorry, no comments here, and he envisaged, and this is the way that history research is going in the Middle Ages, we now have databases of all the clergy in the Middle Ages. We have a growing database of merchants, We have a database of the monks, the nuns, and the friars. Mark Cornwall thought, if we had all the universities pooling together, it would take probably 10 to 20 years, it would be possible to get at least 2/3 of the entire population of 14th and 15th century England on a database with a brief biography of who they were and where they lived, which would transform our understanding of the medieval world. A huge boon to family historians and genealogists, but it would be remarkable. Sorry.
No, sorry. Next question. While anybody's thinking, can I just introduce another figure into this, who is, this is the villain that you can boo in this. I think most of us will have heard of Judge Jeffreys after the Monmouth Rebellion. Well, there was an equivalent, a man called Robert Tressilian. And apart from the Archbishop of Canterbury being murdered, so was the then Lord Chief Justice. He was succeeded by a man called Robert Tressilian, and he had a terrible reputation. However, he came to a bad end because in one of the twists and turns of Richard's reign, he got on the wrong side and he got executed. But he is one of the great villains of the piece. Anybody thought of another question? Okay. One final thought before I let Marcus sum up. As you know, the Church of England is now looking for a new Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, here's a thought for you. Simon Sudbury was Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of the Exchequer. So how about Rachel Reeves as Archbishop of Canterbury?
Thank you so much for coming this evening. Now, your handouts, please do take them away. And if you look on the back of your handouts, there's a list of a new course, Poets and Pilgrims in the Pub, which I have been setting up with the lovely licensee and lay reader, Jill Pickford, who's sitting at the back on the right-hand side of the church at the moment. There are up to 50 people. This is going to be fun. I appreciate that we don't have a break here, and it's a bit more sort of theatre-like. But the idea is, I will provide you with a free copy, or you can buy it off me for £5, of the Canterbury Tales in modern English verse. Up to 50 of us will sit in the upper room in the Monk's Walk pub in lovely surroundings for an hour, and we'll read the tale together in modern English, in small groups of 6 around the table, and out loud, and I'll comment on it. I'll put the background in advance on the general prologue. And then we'll have a drinks break for 15 minutes, or probably go for 20 minutes, and then you'll have 6 or 7 questions to discuss. And we're going to look initially at the nun's priest's tale, which is a wonderful, funny tale about dreams, about Chanticleer and Pertolote and the nature of dreams, followed by the prioress's tale, the miller's tale, and the wife of Bath's tale. And then there'll be 4 more sessions later on, but you're warmly invited to come to that as well. It's a chance to meet and talk together and actually enjoy a bit of medieval literature. And of course, the Canterbury Tales is written not long after the Peasants' Revolt. Geoffrey Chaucer is the poet of Richard II's reign. So I'll be referring both to this talk and my next talk, which is The Naughtiest Nuns of England, which of course will give you some background detail on who the prioress and the nun's priest that Chaucer is talking about might be. Anyway, do keep that and take these away with you, and there are more copies that'll be advertised on Facebook. But I don't know if I did emphasize the point quite a lot, that Marxist historians, in particular the arts and crafts movement, William Morris in the 1890s, saw a lot of inspiration in the Peasants' Revolt of actually trying to give the working classes and the artisans a greater say in society. But I have continued to be astonished. And that after the Coppendale family, there was another family which grows in Beverley, which becomes really important, but unfortunately they call themselves the Beverley family. And there's a Thomas of Beverley, who's the guy they elect as being the older man as part of this rebellion. And you see this in other places. Where I grew up as a child in the village of Wilberforce, by Kexley, by Stamford Bridge near York. The leading family, they're never entitled, they're never nobled, is the Wilberforce family, which emerges in the 12th and 13th century. And they're just peasants who actually, largely through intermarriage, having just the right number of kids, you just marry well, and so you inherit that bit of strip farming in a medieval feudal system which your neighbours had, and after a few generations you build it up, and you become the leading family of the village, and you're making a bit more extra money by selling stuff to the market. You actually, and you take on the name of the village, you actually become almost gentry in your own right. And we do have growing numbers of these families, like the Pocklington family, the Barnby Moore family, who are as rich, or if not even richer than some of their lords of the manor. And this has led to a whole sort of reassessment about how big the middle class in the Middle Ages is. And that's why the term peasant is incredibly unhelpful. What the documents of the time repeatedly refer to, and when they introduced tax, so for instance, Beverley initially for a period is exempted, because of St. John of Beverley, from having to contribute to the King's Navy in fighting in France. They don't have to, like Hull, provide 2 barges and a Ballinger. But Richard II gets rid of that, and actually in his sort of tyranny insists, no, Beverley is not going to be exempt, I don't care about St. John any longer, I'm going to get a barge out of you. But the reference is also, the taxes will be made from the middling sort. That's the phrase, the middling sort is a reference that keeps referring in medieval documents of the 14th, 15th century to the middle class. Anyway, thank you for coming.
Thank you for our lecture. Also, thank you very much for our music.
If anyone wants to know a little bit more about music from that time, there's also another very, very well-known English folk song known as John the Red-Nosed or The Cutty Wren, that is very much attributed to the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, and that the lyrics have a way deeper meaning behind it. So Google that one if you want to find out more.
Can I just say I will put the few remaining copies of the handout at the back by the donations bowl. But thank you again for coming and your support, and come to the future ones.
Thank you.